I wanted to touch on, oh God, something's going on there. Hey everyone, this is Tyler from Craft & Tailor. In this episode of Under the Radar, I'm talking vintage Tudor, specifically vintage Tudor Oysters. I have on my wrist right now a 1956 Tudor Oyster 7934, and it's a beautiful watch. It has really nice gold details. It has a white dial with a chapter ring. It has a lot of things that make it really cool. So let's get into it. So the Rolex Tudor relationship started back in 1926 when Rolex acquired Tudor. Tudor was originally a London-based watchmaker, and Rolex acquired them because they needed a sort of subsidiary or a brother brand to kind of develop more affordable watches that were able to be produced on a larger scale than Rolex. Rolex were produced for the most part in-house, their movements at least, which was much more time consuming, as well as not as replicatable of a process. Whereas if they use a mass-produced movement like an ETA or an A-Shield, then it was a lot easier to just buy a bulk of movements, put them in specifically made cases, and then sell them to the masses. The cost of manufacturing goes down, which the cost to the end user goes down, hence the more affordable prices for Tudor in this era, and basically throughout the entire relationship between Tudor and Rolex. So why am I talking about Tudor? Because we all know what Tudor is. We all love Tudor. Tudor is an impressive company that has produced exceptional watches for an extremely long time. Until this day, I think modern Tudor is one of the coolest companies producing watches at the moment. So I wanted to touch on the vintage Tudor market, specifically the Tudor Oysters that are sometimes in the more 34, 35, 36 millimeter range. From the 1960s, 50s, these like very vintage models, early waterproof watchmaking that I think have a lot of really cool details that make it feel distinctly Rolex, but also uniquely Tudor at the same time. This watch in particular, this 1956 7934 is a gorgeous watch. I can definitely see the Rolex influence in this watch, but I can also see kind of the more experimental Tudor aspects to the watch as well, that I think are definitely distinct to the 1950s, 60s era. So to the untrained eye, a Rolex Oyster and a Tudor Oyster sitting side by side may not have that many big of differences. Obviously the logo, obviously the name of the brand may be different. However, they would seem relatively similar. It's not until you get to the more granular details where you kind of see the differences between these two, and then once you notice them, they are very apparent, in my personal opinion. In this era, Tudor was producing watches in the 34, 35 millimeter range for their Oyster lines. However, though they are that smaller case design, the lugs and the bezels are extremely broad. Lugs are a lot thicker, the bezel is a lot thicker, which adds a lot of dimension and also body to the watch, which makes it wear kind of larger than Rolex Oysters in this same era. And though it may seem like a small difference, I think it does add to the overall presence of the watch as a whole. When looking at the dial details of this watch, it is a nice white dial. It's kind of aged to a more cream coloration, which personally I'm a really big fan of, especially for these older models. It is a white dial, however, we still have a chapter ring, which if you follow vintage Rolex at all, chapter ring gilt dials are extremely collectible, as well as chapter ring Tudor gilt dials are also very, very collectible. But to see it in a printed white dial is definitely more uncommon, and I think adds to the overall aesthetic of the dial. I think it's kind of a nice vintage look that is pretty uncommon, and it's something that you can only really get from a watch that's from the 50s. Of course, it could be recreated today. However, I think the true charm in this watch is it is original to the piece. I really am just a really big fan of stainless steel watches that have gold markers and gold hands, especially when they have like a blued steel sweep seconds hand. I personally used to have a Rolex Explorer from the 50s that had a similar dial layout, and it was one of my favorite watches, and I kind of regret selling it. But this watch gives me a very similar experience on wrist, and I think it just has one of the best aesthetics and the unique set of alpha hands that have sort of this sword hilt and right before the center of the hand stack. I think it just adds another level of sophistication to the aesthetics of the watch, and I think it's overall beautiful. And also, this was technically a waterproof watch of the era. However, I wouldn't submerge this watch today. I think that's just kind of a general rule with vintage watches, especially watches from the 50s. What I like about these watches and why I think they are under the radar is Tudor is most well known for their sports pieces, for their more notable watches of, especially their dive watches of like the 70s and the 80s, and the Tudor Snowflake being an extremely important watch, or their big blocks, their chronographs. All of these watches are moving up market at a pretty healthy rate, I would say. And I think rightfully so, because Tudor was kind of sitting a little bit more dormant behind Rolex until people started to catch on that these were still very much so Rolex, but also very unique and more explorative of different designs. So while Tudor is definitely getting rightful recognition in those more expected aspects of the brand, these are still relatively underpriced. I think they are a relatively great value for the available watches in this price range. I think there is a really nice aesthetic available that would be familiar to Rolex fans, however, unique enough to not feel like you're getting the same watch as everybody else. This watch can be worn casually, it can be worn more dressed up. Right now I'm kind of in more of a business casual garb, and I think it looks great, but there is a bunch of different dial variations, a bunch of different case sort of nuances that these watches in this era can offer. They produced a lot of different references produced in not super large quantities. So there's a lot of different variation, however, there isn't a ton in each one, which I think kind of makes collecting them a little bit more fun, because you can kind of see the differences and see the similarities between references while still getting something that's unique and exclusive to, that price point, I think. This Tudor 7934 is for sale currently. It is on our website at craftandtailor.com. So we'll leave a link below. Be sure to check that out if you want to learn a little bit more about it. But with that, I want to say thank you for watching. Be sure to like, comment, and subscribe, and follow us on Instagram at craftandtailored. And if you have watch questions, we are here to help. You can drop us a line at info@craftandtailor.com. Thanks, and we'll see you in the next one. The watch a lot more body and a lot more rookie mistake over there. Dang.
Hey, there's a
wow.
There's a one time for everything.
Okay. All right.